Day 40. I scratched it into the wall beside the breaker panel with a finishing nail, same as the 39 before it. And the sound it made against the poured concrete was the only music left in my life. 40 days, 40 identical mornings, waking under fluorescent light that never changed color because the sun had no jurisdiction here. 40 nights lying on a cot that smelled like someone else's storage unit, listening to the air recycler push the same atoms through the same filters and return them to my lungs like a gift I hadn't asked for. Then, at 7:14 a.m., by the battery clock I'd mounted above the water heater, someone outside said my name. A pounding, not screaming, not the guttural, wet staccato the infected make when they sense warmth through concrete. A voice, clear, female, and steady, the way you'd call someone to dinner. Renat Saidi. 2 words that cracked 40 days of silence like a rock through a windshield. I need to go back. You don't understand what hearing your own name means until no one has used it in 6 weeks. 14 of us went into this bunker. That fact matters, so hold it. 14 people entered the sub-level shelter beneath the First Evangelical Church of Beaumont, Texas, on March 9th. And I was not the one who locked the door. That was Pastor Lewis Greer, 63 years old, built like a man who'd poured his own foundation. Voice like gravel, shifting in a coffee can. He sealed the hydraulic door with a key only he carried, looked at the 13 of us arranged across the fellowship hall's underground annex, and said, 40 days. That's the number Scripture gives for trial. That's the number we honor. Nobody argued. Outside, Beaumont was screaming. The bunker was never designed for 14. It was designed for the Greer family. Lewis, his wife Constance, and their adult son Boyd. During hurricane season, 3 cots, a gravity-fed water tank connected to a private well, a propane generator with 400 gallons of fuel, and enough canned food to keep a family of 3 comfortable for 90 days. Lewis had built it in 2014, after a sermon about preparedness he apparently took as divine instruction. It was clean, ventilated, and engineered with the quiet competence of a man who'd spent 30 years in industrial HVAC before he heard the call. But 3 is not 14, and 90 days of food for 3 is barely 40 days of food for 14, which meant Lewis's biblical number wasn't theology. It was math. I'm Ren. I was 29 years old, a structural engineer for a firm in Houston, and I was in Beaumont because I'd driven down to assess hurricane damage to a municipal parking structure on contract. I had no connection to this church, no connection to anyone inside it, and no particular faith to sustain me through to the trial Pastor Greer was prescribing. What I had was proximity. When the outbreak hit, when the infection turned Beaumont's Gulf Coast humidity into an incubator, and the hospital collapsed in under 16 hours. I was eating lunch at a taqueria 4 blocks from First Evangelical. The owner locked the door, then bled from his eyes into the rice. I ran. The church was the first open building with a downward staircase, and Lewis was already ushering people in. 13 strangers. Let me name the ones who matter, because by day 40, not all of them still did. Constance Greer sat beside her husband like a woman who had rehearsed this moment privately for a decade. Boyd Greer, 31, stood at the sealed door with his arms folded and his jaw working as though he was chewing something that wouldn't break down. There was a woman named Aurelia Molina, mid-40s, still in her postal carrier uniform, who had carried a child under her arm through the church's side entrance like a parcel she refused to mark undeliverable. The child's name was Tomas. He was 6. He was not hers. She'd found him standing in a crosswalk, holding a lunchbox while the world inverted around him. And she had made the only decision available to a person still in possession of their soul. And there was Emmett Shane. I need you to understand, Emmett, because everything that happened in that bunker bends around him like light around mass. Emmett Shane was 54, lean the way a cable is lean. With hands that had been broken and reset so many times, his fingers rested at angles God hadn't drafted. He told us within the first hour that he'd spent 22 years as a correctional officer at the Stiles unit in Beaumont. He said this without pride or apology. the way you'd report a weather condition. He also said, while Lewis was still organizing sleeping arrangements and Constance was inventorying canned goods, that 14 people on 40 days of rations meant somebody would be making decisions about allocation within a week, and that he'd seen how those decisions played out in confined populations, and that he recommended we establish the framework now while everyone was still civil. Lewis told him to have faith. Emmett said faith doesn't metabolize. That exchange defined the first week. Lewis governed from scripture and moral authority. Emmett governed from nothing. He held no position, claimed no title. But when he spoke, the room recalibrated toward him like a compass needle finding reluctant north. They didn't argue openly. It was subtler than that. Lewis would announce a ration schedule based on equal shares. Emmett would ask, quietly, whether Thomas and the two elderly women, Bev Kessler and Dot Okafor, both north of 70, required the same caloric intake as Boyd, who was 6'2" and 240 and burning energy just by existing. Lewis would say equality serves God. Emmett would say arithmetic serves survival. And 13 people would watch, choosing sides with their eyes. I chose neither. I want that on record. Not out of wisdom, but out of cowardice dressed as pragmatism. I told myself I was the outsider, the one with no relational stake, the neutral structural engineer, assessing load-bearing capacity while others debated the architecture. This was a lie I maintained for 9 days. On day 3, the first infected reached the door. We heard it the way you hear a bird hit a window. A dull, biological thud, followed by a silence that felt like the world flinching. Then another, then a dragging, a scraping, a sound like someone trying to open a jar with no hands. Tomas, who had spoken exactly 4 words since entering the bunker, "Where's my mom?" pressed himself into Aurelia's side and stopped blinking. Boyd picked up a length of pipe he'd leaned against the generator housing and held it like a man who had been waiting for permission to hold it. Lewis said a prayer. Emmett counted the thuds. 3, he said. Maybe 4. They're not coordinated. Strays. How do you know? Boyd's voice had the compressed quality of someone who suspects they're being managed. Because if they were clustered, you wouldn't hear individual impacts. You'd hear pressure, continuous, like water against a dam. Emmett had never encountered the infected before that week. None of us had, not up close, but he spoke about them with the fluency of a man who understood confinement, who had spent 2 decades watching what happened to human behavior in sealed systems, and who recognized that the things outside our door were simply the end point of a process he'd been observing in slower motion his entire career. I didn't understand that then. I do now. The sounds lasted 2 hours, then stopped. Lewis declared it a test passed. Emmett said nothing, but I saw him walk the perimeter of the bunker that evening, pressing his palm flat against every wall, every seam, every joint, the way I would assess a structure. He was reading the bunker, learning its vocabulary, mapping the places where 40 days of pressure would find expression. By day 5, the ration issue surfaced exactly as Emmett predicted. Not as conflict, not yet, but as awareness. 14 people eating 3 times a day watched the shelves with a focus that sharpened by the hour. Constance, who managed the inventory with a spiral notebook and a mechanical pencil, started closing the pantry curtain after meals. Boyd started eating faster. Bev Kessler, who had diabetes and needed consistent caloric timing, began apologizing every time she ate, which was its own form of violence, the quiet kind that makes everyone complicit. On day 6, Emmett proposed the tiered system. Not publicly. He brought it to me at my cot at 11 at night, while the bunker slept in its shallow, fluorescent-lit imitation of darkness. "You're the engineer," he said. "Structural. Buildings, not systems. A population in a closed container is a structural problem." He sat on the edge of my cot without asking. "You know it, or you wouldn't be running the numbers in your head every time Constance opens the pantry curtain." He was right. I'd been calculating since day 2. 14 people, 90 days of food for 3, meant roughly 19 days of food at equal distribution. Lewis's 40-day target required cutting intake to 47% of standard. Survivable, but miserable. And only if no one was sick, pregnant, or expending extra energy. What's the tier? I asked. Children and medical need first. Full allocation, workers second. Anyone maintaining generator, water, sanitation, reduced allocation. Everyone else, baseline. Enough to function, not enough to feel full. And who decides who's a worker? Emmett looked at me. That's why I'm talking to you and not Lewis. I said no. Not because the system was wrong. It was, in fact, the most rational framework anyone had proposed. But because I understood what Emmett was actually building. He wasn't designing a ration schedule. He was designing a hierarchy. And he wanted me as its structural justification, the engineer who could prove the math, who could stand in front of 13 people and say, the numbers require this, and make authority look like physics. I told him to bring it to Lewis. Emmett smiled the way a man smiles when a chess piece moves exactly where he expected. By day 8, Lewis proposed a modified version of the tiered system. He framed it as stewardship, as biblical provision. The shepherd allocates according to the needs of the flock. The tiers were essentially Emmett's, laundered through scripture. Thomas and the elderly received full rations. Emmett, Boyd, and a man named Gerald Pace, who'd taken over generator maintenance, received worker tier allocations. The rest of us, myself, Aurelia, a couple in their 30s named Derek and Soo-Yun Park, and 3 others whose names I'm ashamed to say I've already begun forgetting, received baseline. No one objected. The system had arrived wearing the pastor's collar, and that made it holy. Emmett caught my eye across the room during Lewis's announcement. He didn't nod. He didn't need to. The architecture was in place, and it didn't matter whose name was on the blueprint. What I didn't anticipate, what none of us anticipated, was that the system would work. For 12 days, it worked beautifully. Tomas gained back weight he'd lost. Bev's blood sugar stabilized. The workers maintained the generator, the water pump, the chemical toilet that Gerald had rigged to vent through an existing pipe chase. We fell into rhythm. Lewis led morning devotions that even I attended, not out of faith, but because the ritual provided temporal structure in a space where time had gone featureless. Constance tracked calories in her notebook with an accountant's precision. Boyd patrolled the door twice daily, pressing his ear to the steel, reporting what he heard. The infected came and went in waves. Some days, nothing. Other days, hours of that terrible, patient pressure, not breaking in, just leaning, the way water leans against a levee. Boyd said they were testing. Emmett said they weren't testing anything. They were just attracted to the faint thermal signature of the generator exhaust. And once the heat dispersed, they'd drift. This distinction mattered more than it sounds, because Boyd's interpretation assigned intelligence, and Emmett's assigned mechanics, and the question of whether the things outside were thinking determined how afraid we were entitled to be. On day 20, Soo-Yun Park collapsed during morning rations. She hit the concrete floor with a sound I will never fully file away. The specific, unrehearsed percussion of a human body surrendering to gravity without negotiation. Derek caught her head before it struck. Her skin was the color of candle wax, and her pulse, when I pressed my fingers to her wrist, was a suggestion rather than a statement. Dehydration. The water tank, which Lewis had assured us was connected to a functioning well, was drawing at 60% of its rated capacity. The well pump was solar-assisted and without the panels, which were on the church roof, inaccessible. It relied on a battery backup that was slowly dying. Gerald had been supplementing with manual priming, but the effort required was escalating daily. And he hadn't told anyone, because Gerald Pace was the kind of man who solved problems silently until the silence became the problem. We had enough water for 14 people for another 12 days at current consumption. After that, the math returned, harder and colder than before. Emmett proposed reducing the population, not killing, not ejecting. He proposed a voluntary departure, opening the door and allowing anyone who chose to leave to do so, reducing the resource burden on the remaining group. He proposed this at a full assembly in his flat correctional officer cadence, and the bunker went so quiet I could hear the generator's fuel pump cycling. "Nobody is leaving," Lewis said. "We committed to 40 days. You committed to 40 days. Emmett's voice didn't rise. "Some of these people committed to not dying. Those might be different schedules." Derek stood up, still holding Soo-Yoon's hand, and said if anyone was leaving, it should be the people without families. He looked at me when he said it. Then he looked at Emmett. We were the only two unattached adults in the bunker, and Derek's math was simple. The expendable are the unconnected. I felt something shift in my chest, a tectonic adjustment, as though a plate I hadn't known was resting against another plate had slipped. Derek wasn't wrong by his own calculus, but his calculus assumed that connection was the unit of human value. And I had spent 29 years building structures that didn't care who loved them. "Nobody leaves," Lewis repeated. "We solve this together." Gerald said he could increase the manual priming schedule. Boyd volunteered to help. Constance recalculated water rations. The crisis passed. Or rather, it submerged, diving below the visible surface, like something that had learned to swim deeper. Emmett found me again that night. "He's going to get people killed," he said, meaning Lewis. "Or he's going to keep people human," I said, surprising myself. Emmett considered this. Those might be different schedules too. Day 23, and Constance's notebook became the most powerful object in the bunker. She'd moved beyond tracking calories into tracking everything: water draw rates, generator fuel consumption per hour, battery voltage curves, chemical toilet capacity, even the rate at which our single first aid kit was depleting. She presented her findings at evening assembly with the composed severity of an auditor revealing a company's insolvency. We had 17 days of food at current tier rates, 12 days of water assuming Gerald maintained the manual pump schedule, which was costing him 4 hours of physical labor daily and visibly degrading his body. He'd lost weight he didn't have to spare, and his hands were blistering from the pump handle. Fuel for the generator would last 26 days. But the generator was producing more heat than the ventilation system was designed to expel, and the ambient temperature in the bunker had risen 4 degrees since we entered. In a Beaumont spring, where the ground temperature was already warm, 4 degrees meant the difference between uncomfortable and medically concerning. Lewis listened, nodded, and said God would provide. Constance looked at her husband with an expression I recognized from job site meetings. When an owner tells the engineer the budget is non-negotiable and the engineer knows the foundation won't hold. What nobody said aloud, Constance's numbers meant we couldn't make 40 days. Not all 14 of us. The math was unambiguous. Even at reduced rations, even with the water pump running on Gerald's broken hands, the system would fail around day 34 or 35, 6 days short of Lewis's holy number. Boyd said we should cut rations further. Bev Kessler, who at 73 had the sharpest mind in the room, said further cuts would produce cognitive impairment within 4 days and physical collapse within 8, which meant we'd be saving food for people too weak to eat it. Emmett said nothing. He was watching Lewis the way a structural engineer watches a beam under load. Not waiting for it to fail, but calculating the precise moment failure becomes inevitable. I spent that night doing something I hadn't done since entering the bunker. I examined the structure itself, not as a resident, but as a professional. I walked the perimeter with my palm against the walls, exactly as I'd seen Emmett do weeks earlier, and I found what he must have already found. The bunker was settling. Not dramatically, not dangerously, not yet. But the southeast corner, where the wall met the floor slab, had developed a hairline crack that was weeping moisture. The soil outside was saturated. Beaumont sits on coastal clay that moves like slow water, and the bunker, designed for seasonal occupation, was experiencing sustained loading it had never been engineered to sustain. Lewis had built well, but he'd built for hurricanes, which are acute events. This was chronic. The differential settlement was maybe 3 millimeters, and it would take months to become structural. But the moisture intrusion was already here. And moisture meant the one thing a sealed environment cannot tolerate: an uncontrolled variable. I told Gerald first, because Gerald understood systems. He crawled under the water heater with me and looked at the crack with a flashlight and said a word I won't repeat in front of a recording device. Then he said, "Can we seal it?" I said we could slow it. He found a tube of silicon caulk in Lewis's tool cabinet, and we dressed the crack that night while the bunker slept. I did not tell Lewis. I did not tell Emmett. The first omission was pragmatic. Lewis would pray over it, which would accomplish nothing. The second was instinctive. Emmett would use it, and I didn't yet know how. Day 25 brought the first real argument. Not the measured philosophical friction between Lewis and Emmett that had characterized the early weeks, but an ugly, intimate, human explosion that cracked the bunker's social architecture more visibly than the settling was cracking its physical one. It started with Tomas. The boy had been eating full rations for 3 weeks, and Aurelia had been supplementing those rations with portions of her own, which he thought no one noticed. Soo-Yun noticed. Soo-Yun, still recovering from her collapse, still shaky, still operating on the visceral math of someone who'd almost died from a scarcity, noticed that Aurelia's weight loss was inconsistent with her allocation, and that Thomas's relative health was inconsistent with his. She told, and Boyd, who had been walking the perimeter of his father's authority for 25 days with the compressed energy of a man whose inheritance was being distributed by committee, saw an opportunity. "She's stealing from the system," Boyd said at morning assembly. He was standing, which in the bunker's low-ceilinged space gave him a physical authority that seated people couldn't match. Aurelia's giving her rations to the kid. That means she's consuming less than baseline, which means she'll collapse like Soo-Yun did, which means we'll have another medical emergency we can't afford. Aurelia's face did something I've never seen a face do. It simultaneously flushed and drained, as though the blood couldn't decide whether to fight or flee and split the difference. She looked at Thomas, who was sitting on his cot holding his lunchbox. The same lunchbox he'd been carrying in the crosswalk, now empty, a relic he wouldn't release. And she said, "He's 6, and he's eating for 7, Boyd said. Everyone sees it." The room fractured, not into 2 sides, as you might expect, but into something more unstable. A web of individual calculations, each person measuring their own hunger against Thomas's face, their own survival against the weight of a child they hadn't chosen. I watched it happen like watching a load test exceed tolerance. The fracture was silent, distributed, and irreversible. Lewis diffused the assembly by declaring a day of fasting and prayer, which solved nothing but bought 24 hours of silence. During that silence, Emmett made his second move. He came to me at the water heater, where I was checking the caulked crack. It was holding, but the moisture stain had expanded an inch in 2 days, which meant the hydrostatic pressure outside was increasing. Rain, probably. Vermont in March is rain after rain, and the water table was rising toward us like a slow hand reaching up through the clay. "You found the crack," Emmett said. Not a question. Gerald and I sealed it. Gerald and you sealed the symptom, the structure's being loaded beyond its design envelope. You know that. I did. I also knew that telling 14 people their shelter was slowly being compromised by the same earth that was supposed to protect them would achieve nothing productive. We couldn't reinforce the walls from inside. We couldn't drain the exterior soil. We could only watch and patch. "What do you want, Emmett?" "Same thing I've wanted since day one. A rational conversation about timeline." He sat on an overturned bucket and laid it out. Not 40 days, 32. That was the maximum sustainable occupancy for 14 people given current resources and structural conditions. 32 days would consume 94% of food and water, leave enough generator fuel to maintain ventilation for the final push, and, critically, leave a margin for the door mechanism, which was hydraulic and required power to unseal. If we go to 40, Emmett said, we'll be opening that door with no food, no water, and no certainty the hydraulics will function. Lewis's number isn't a trial. It's a death sentence. Then tell him. I've told him. Every way I know how. He hears scripture, not arithmetic. So what do you want from me? Build the case. You're the engineer. Put Constance's numbers next to your structural assessment and give this group something they can see. Lewis deals in faith. These people deal in fear. Give them something between the two. I understood what he was asking. Not a report. A weapon. A document that would strip Lewis's authority by proving his timeline was physically impossible. And I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that Emmett wasn't wrong. We probably couldn't make 40 days. The math didn't support it. The structure didn't support it. The human body's burning calories on this thin air didn't support it. But I'd watched Emmett operate for 25 days, and I'd seen how he built systems. Not from the top like Lewis, with proclamation and moral weight. From the bottom, with quiet conversations, with individual persuasions, with architectural precision that made each person feel they'd reached their own conclusion. He'd built a parallel governance structure inside Lewis's bunker without Lewis ever seeing the blueprints. And now, he wanted me to provide the load calculations that would bring the old structure down. I told him I'd think about it. He left, and I sat beside the water heater in the fluorescent humming silence and thought about the 14 names scratched into my memory and the question that structural engineers are never supposed to ask. Not what the building can sustain, but who it should sustain it for. Day 27. Okafor stopped eating. Not dramatically, not as protest. She simply began returning her ration packets to Constance with a small smile and a pat on the hand, and the words, "I'm not hungry, dear," Constance told Lewis. Lewis told Dot she needed to maintain her strength. Dot said, "I've maintained enough, Pastor. 74 years of maintaining. I think I'll rest now." This was different from the rationing arguments, different from the resource calculations, different from Emmett's structural maneuvering. This was a woman making a private decision about the disposition of her own life, and doing it with such gentleness that it took 3 days for the bunker to understand what was happening. Dot wasn't fasting. Dot was leaving. She just hadn't told her body yet. Aurelia sat with her, hours at a time on the edge of Dot's cot, talking about nothing. Postal routes, weather patterns, a nephew who built modeled trains. Tomas sat on the floor beside them and drew pictures on the back of old church bulletins Lewis had stored in a filing cabinet. He drew houses. Every picture was a house with a door, and the door was always open. I watched this and felt something come loose in my chest that I hadn't realized was bolted down. I'd spent 27 days treating this bunker as a system. Inputs, outputs, load-bearing calculations, resource curves. And here was a 6-year-old drawing open doors beside a woman choosing to die so others could eat, attended by a stranger who'd carried him out of a crosswalk because her arms were available, and his life required arms. None of this was a system. None of this could be engineered. On day 28, I went to Emmett and told him I wouldn't build his case. "Then people will die in here," he said. "People are already dying in here. Dot's choosing it. Gerald's hands are infected from the pump. Bev's rationing her insulin because she knows the supply is finite. People are dying in here, Emmett, and your timeline doesn't change that. It just changes the address." Emmett looked at me for a long time. Then he said something that still reverberates. "You think there's a version of this where everyone walks out? There isn't. There's only versions where different people don't." Day 30. And the crack under the water heater wept through the caulk like a wound that refused to accept treatment. I'd resealed it twice. Gerald had packed it with strips torn from a bedsheet and soaked more in the last of the silicon. But the water table didn't care about our interventions. It was rising on its own schedule, and the bunker's southeast corner was accepting moisture at a rate that would have alarmed me in any professional capacity. In this capacity, it terrified me. The moisture meant secondary problems. Humidity inside the bunker climbed from tolerable to oppressive. The ventilation system, already overtaxed by 14 bodies and a running generator, couldn't process the additional moisture load. Condensation formed on the ceiling, slow, fat drops that fell onto cots and skin, and the electrical panel with equal indifference. Boyd found mold on the underside of his pillow on day 31 and held it up at assembly like evidence in a trial. "The bunker is failing," he said. "My father built it for 3 people in a hurricane. We're 14 people in an extinction." Lewis looked at the pillow, looked at his son, and for the first time since we'd sealed the door, I saw uncertainty cross his face. Not doubt in God, but doubt in concrete, which for a man who'd poured it with his own hands might have been worse. "We have 10 days, Lewis said. 10 days, and we emerge." "Into what?" Su Yun's voice was thin but steady. She'd recovered enough to stand, though she leaned on Derek like a building favoring its better foundation. "We don't know what's up there. We haven't heard anything in weeks." This was true. The infected had stopped coming to the door around day 22. Boyd interpreted this as extinction. They'd moved on, died off, dissolved. Emmett interpreted it as adaptation. They'd learned the door wasn't productive and shifted their patterns. I interpreted it as silence, which is the only thing an engineer can responsibly conclude from insufficient data. But Su Yun's question exposed the deeper problem that none of us had adequately confronted. We had no information about the surface. No radio, no antenna, no communication of any kind. Lewis hadn't included them in his design because hurricanes are finite events. You go in, the storm passes, you come out. The outbreak wasn't a storm. It was a new climate. And we were preparing to emerge into it with exactly as much knowledge as we'd had on day 1, minus 40 days of physical and psychological reserves. Constance opened her notebook. "At current consumption, we have food for 7 days, water for 5, if Gerald can maintain the pump, fuel for 9. The math says we leave by day 35 or we leave with nothing." Emmett didn't say "I told you so." He didn't need to. The room could feel the architecture of his argument standing there beside him. Fully constructed, waiting for occupancy. Lewis dropped his head. Not in prayer, in calculation. I watched a man of faith do arithmetic in real time, and what I saw on his face was not defeat, but recalibration. The same thing I'd seen on 100 job sites when the survey reveals that the ground is not where the plan said it would be. "Day 35, he said. "We opened the door on day 35. Boyd made a sound. Relief, maybe, or the exhalation of pressure he'd been containing since he first stood at that door with a pipe in his hands. Emmett nodded once. The group exhaled collectively, a single organism releasing what it could no longer hold. That night, Dot Okafor died. Quietly, on her cot, with Aurelia's hand in hers and Tomas asleep on the floor beside her. Constance found her at the 6 a.m. inventory check, already cool, already somewhere the bunker's math couldn't follow. Lewis conducted a service. Emmett stood in the back with his arms crossed. Boyd wrapped Dot in a bedsheet and we placed her in the utility closet because there was nowhere else. And the chemical toilet's venting system was the only thing managing the air quality we couldn't afford to compromise. 13 now. I scratched the number beside the day count on the wall and stared at the two figures, day 31, population 13, and understood for the first time that they were the same equation. Gerald's hands finally failed him on day 32. The blisters had ulcerated, and the infection. The mundane, bacterial kind that doesn't reanimate your corpse had spread to his right wrist. He couldn't grip the pump handle. Boyd took over, and the physical cost transferred immediately. Boyd was stronger, but the pump required technique Gerald had developed through days of calibration, and Boyd's brute approach was extracting less water per cycle. Our 5-day water supply became 4. Emmett found me at the crack. The moisture had advanced another 2 inches. The floor in the corner was visibly damp now. a dark stain spreading across the concrete, like a bruise. 35 still works, he said. Barely. If nothing else fails, something else will fail. Something always does. The question is whether it fails before or after we open that door. I looked at him. You've been through something like this before? He didn't answer directly. 22 years in a box, different population, same physics. Confined systems don't decline gradually. They maintain, and then everything goes at once. We're in the maintain phase. When it goes, it'll go fast. How fast? Fast enough that you won't have time to recaulk. Day 34. 12 hours before Lewis's revised deadline. I'd slept an hour total across 2 nights, not from fear but from the sound. A sound, lower and more continuous than the infected had ever produced, coming not from the door, but from the ground itself. The earth around the bunker was shifting, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but audibly, the way a building groans when it's distributing load away from a compromised member. I was the only person with the training to hear structural distress and ambient sound, and I lay on my cot listening to the bunker tell me it was tired. Lewis spent the day preparing, not tactically, spiritually. He wrote letters, one for each of us, on pages torn from Constance's notebook. I watched him write by generator light at the folding table where we ate our shrinking meals, his hand steady, his face carrying the focused grief of a man putting his house in order while the house still stood. He sealed each letter in an envelope from the church's administrative supplies and wrote our names on the front in a precise, upright hand. He placed mine on my cot while I was checking the crack for the last time. I didn't open it then. I still haven't. It's in my pocket now, folded into quarters, and sometimes I press my hand against it and feel the edges of his handwriting through the paper. Emmett spent day 34 doing something I didn't expect, talking to Thomas. He sat on the floor beside the boy, their backs against the wall, and they looked at Thomas's drawings together. Emmett asked questions. Which house is this? Where does this door go? Is this a person or a tree? Thomas answered in short, soft sentences, more words than any of us had heard from him. And Emmett listened with a quality of attention I'd only seen him direct at structural weaknesses. He was reading the child the way he read walls. But for once, he wasn't looking for failure points. He was just reading. Aurelia watched them from across the room. She caught my eye and smiled, and the smile contained so much exhaustion and tenderness and bewilderment that I had to look away. At 10 p.m., Lewis called a final assembly. He stood at the head of the room, Constance beside him, Boyd behind him, and addressed us as a congregation one last time. He said he'd brought us in, and he would take us out. He said the 40 days had not been met, but the trial had been endured. And that was the deeper covenant. He said he'd asked God for a sign and received silence, and that he'd come to understand silence as the most honest answer prayer could offer. He said he would open the door at 6 a.m. Then he reached into his shirt and removed the key. I hadn't seen it since day 1. It hung on a steel chain, a single brass key for the hydraulic lock's manual override, because Lewis, the HVAC man who built for hurricanes, had understood that hydraulics fail and manual backups don't. He held it up, and the fluorescent light caught it, and for a moment, it was the most significant object in the world. "I want Wren to hold this," he said. The room turned to me. I felt their eyes like pressure on a form. "Why?" Boyd asked, and his voice carried a freight of filial injury that 25 years of family history had loaded onto it. "Because Wren has no stake in what's up there. No family pulling, no faith pushing, no anger driving. Wren will open the door when the door should be opened, not before, not after." Emmett was watching me. I could feel his attention like a hand on my shoulder, steady and specific. He didn't object. He didn't endorse. He waited. I took the key. It was warm from Lewis's body, and lighter than I expected, and holding it felt less like authority and more like the moment in a structural inspection when you realize the final assessment is yours and the building doesn't get a vote. We slept. Or we performed the motions of sleep while our minds rehearsed every possible version of what lay beyond the door. I held the key in my fist and listened to the bunker's bones and the breathing of 12 people who'd given me the single decision their lives depended on. And I understood that this was not leadership. Leadership is what Lewis did, what Emmett did. This was something smaller and more terrifying. This was being the hinge. At 4 a.m., Boyd came to my cot. He was carrying the pipe. "I need you to know something," he said. "If we open that door and it's still bad out there, I'm not coming back in. I'd rather die up there than down here. Boyd, my father built this place. I grew up helping him pour the walls. And every day I've been in here, I've been watching his walls sweat and crack and settle. And it's like watching him fail in slow motion. I can't do 6 more hours of it. I need you to know that whatever's up there, I'm going forward." I nodded. He went back to his cot. I lay in the dark, holding a brass key that meant everything, and weighed almost nothing. At 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before the scheduled opening, I heard it. My name. Through a steel hydraulic door, through 4 inches of reinforced concrete, through clay soil and whatever remained of the world above us. Someone said my name. Ren. Ren at CD. I was on my feet before the sound finished. The bunker was already stirring. The pre-dawn restlessness of people who know the next hour changes everything, and my movement drew attention like a match in a dark room. Emmett sat up. Boyd stood. Aurelia pulled Thomas behind her in a motion so instinctive, it must have been the same one she'd used in the crosswalk. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Emmett was already at the door. He pressed his ear to the steel and held up a hand for silence. 12 people stopped breathing. The generator hummed. The water recycler cycled. And then again. "Ren at CD. If you can hear me, my name is Captain Dana Sykes, United States Army Corps of Engineers. We have your coordinates from a pre-outbreak municipal contract registry. We're conducting survivor extraction. If there's anyone alive in this shelter, please respond by any means available. Army Corps of Engineers, my contract. The parking structure assessment." I'd filed my location with the Beaumont Municipal Office as part of the standard site visit protocol. And somewhere in a collapsing administrative system, that record had survived and been found by someone with the authority to act on it. Boyd hit the door with the pipe. 3 sharp strikes. The universal language of "I'm here" when words can't pass through walls. The voice outside responded immediately. "We have you. I count 3 impacts. Can you confirm the number of survivors?" "Oh, 1 strike per person." Boyd looked at me. I looked at Lewis. Lewis was standing by his cot, still in the posture of a man who was supposed to open the door at 6 a.m. and is now confronted with the truth that the schedule has been disrupted by Salvation arriving 13 minutes early. His face held the complex surprise of someone whose prayer was answered in a language he hadn't prayed in. I took the pipe from Boyd. I struck the door 13 times, slow even, counted. Each impact was a name. I heard them in my head as the steel rang. Lewis, Constance, Boyd, Emmett, Aurelia, Thomas, Gerald, Bev, Derek, Suyun, and 3 others whose names I held, even as I felt them fading. And Dot, I thought, but didn't strike. Dot had already been counted by something beyond my arithmetic. Silence outside. Then, 13 survivors confirmed. Can you unseal the door from your side? The key was in my hand. The key Lewis had given me 12 hours earlier, the key to a door he'd built for hurricanes and sealed against extinction. I looked at him. "Open it," Lewis said, and smiled. And the smile was 25 days too late and exactly on time. The hydraulic lock had a manual override panel beside the door frame. I inserted the key, turned it. The lock disengaged with a mechanical thunk that I felt in my teeth. The hydraulic arms, still powered by the generator's last reserves, began to move. The door shifted. A crack appeared. Not the weeping structural crack I'd been monitoring in the southeast corner, but a crack of light, Real light, morning light, golden and warm, and so violently beautiful that Su Yun made a sound I can only describe as the opposite of the one she'd made when she collapsed. The door opened. Air moved. Real air. Humid, floral, layered with a complexity the recycler could never replicate. It hit my lungs, and I understood for the first time that I'd been breathing a translation of air for 40 days and had forgotten what the original language tasted like. Captain Dana Sykes stood in the stairwell that led up to the church's ground floor. She was small, composed, wearing fatigues that had seen uninterrupted service, with a sidearm on her hip and a tablet in her hand. Behind her, 2 soldiers in full tactical gear flanked the stairs. Above them, through the stairwell's open door, I could see the church sanctuary, collapsed partially, pews scattered, stained glass blown inward. And beyond that, daylight. "Renat Sidi," she said, looking at me. "That's me. You're listed as a structural engineer on contract with Beaumont Public Works." I was assessing a parking structure. She almost smiled. "We're going to need that skill set." Beaumont was not what we left. I need to be precise about this, because the difference matters. We'd gone in during an acute outbreak. Chaos, screaming, collapse in real time. What we emerged into was post-acute. The screaming was over. What replaced it was a reorganized silence. The kind a building has after renovations, strip it to studs. The bones were visible. The skin was gone. Captain Sykes led us up the stairwell in pairs, each flanked by a soldier. The church sanctuary's partial collapse had opened the west wall, and through the gap, I could see Jefferson Street. Or what had been Jefferson Street. Now a cleared corridor with vehicle barricades at each intersection, and painted markers on the asphalt indicating safe lanes, hazard zones, and something labeled bio-positive in red block letters that I didn't ask about because I didn't want to know yet. A military truck waited at the curb. Not an armored vehicle. A standard transport with canvas sides. The kind you'd see at a National Guard mobilization. Its ordinariness was almost more destabilizing than the destruction around it. The apocalypse had gotten organized enough for logistics. Gerald needed help climbing in. His hands were wrapped in the last of our medical gauze, and the infection had traveled to his forearm, giving the skin a tight, shiny quality that made Sykes look at her medic and nod once. Bev was assisted by a soldier who handled her with the practiced care of someone who'd been extracting elderly survivors as a routine task. Boyd climbed in under his own power, sat down, and turned his face toward the open back of the truck and didn't look away from the sky for the entire drive. Tomas held Aurelia's hand. He held his lunchbox in the other. When the truck started moving, he opened the lunchbox for the first time since I'd known him, and inside was a photograph. A woman and a man and a boy at a kitchen table. The specific geography of a family eating breakfast. He held it up to Aurelia and said, "That's them." Aurelia looked at the photograph and at the boy and at the wrecked street passing outside the canvas, and she said, "I know, baby, I know." Louis and Constance sat together, his arm around her shoulders, her head against his neck, the posture of 2 people who'd been holding a weight so long that setting it down required physical recalibration. Louis's lips moved. I think he was praying, but for once it looked less like petition and more like gratitude. And the distinction was written in how his hands had stopped gripping and started resting. Emmett sat across from me. The truck bounced over something. Rubble, a barricade seam, a body. I didn't look. And he steadied himself with a hand on the bench. His eyes were moving the way they'd moved inside the bunker, reading, evaluating, processing the new environment with the same relentless analytical fluency he'd applied to the old one. But something was different. Inside the bunker, his reading had been adversarial. Finding weaknesses, mapping failures, designing countermeasures. Here, in the open air, with the sun on his face for the first time in 35 days, his eyes held something I could only describe as unfamiliarity with peace. Sykes rode in the cab. She'd given us minimal information: extraction point, medical processing, provisional shelter assignment. In the clipped, efficient manner of someone managing a volume of suffering that exceeded any individual's capacity for empathy. She wasn't cold. She was calibrated. I recognized the posture from engineering inspections after disasters. You don't stop caring. You just learn to care at a sustainable rate. The drive took 40 minutes. We passed through 3 checkpoints, each manned by a mix of military and civilian personnel wearing colored armbands. Red for medical, blue for logistics, green for something unspecified that I'd learn about later. The city beyond the checkpoints was a patchwork. Some blocks intact, some leveled, some in the specific intermediate state of structures that had been deliberately demolished to create fire breaks or sight lines. I read the demolition patterns professionally, automatically, and recognized military engineering doctrine: clear the corners, maintain the corridors, sacrifice the secondary to protect the primary. The extraction point was a stadium, Lamar University's Montaigne Center, converted into a processing hub with the efficiency that only real institutional catastrophe can motivate. The parking lot held hundreds of vehicles. Military, civilian, converted. The stadium's entrance was flanked by medical tents, water distribution stations, and a communications array bristling with antennas. We climbed out. 13 people standing in a parking lot in March sunlight, blinking, unsteady, alive. A medic approached Gerald immediately. Another guided Bev toward the medical tent. Derek and Soo-Yoon stood holding each other in the specific way of people who need physical confirmation that the other is still dimensional. Sykes found me. "You'll be processed through the engineering intake," she said. "We need structural assessors for the clearance teams. The Corps lost 60% of regional personnel in the first week. I just spent 35 days in a hole, and now you're out. Welcome to the surface at CD. It needs a lot of work." The stadium's interior had been reorganized with the systematic efficiency of a mind that refuses to acknowledge the scale of what it's managing. Sections of seating remained intact, occupied by families and individuals in various states of recovery. Some sitting upright, alert, actively engaging with processing personnel, others lying across bench seats with the flat, affectless stare of people whose emergency responses had finally exceeded capacity and shut down. The field itself was partitioned with temporary walls into zones: medical, intake, communications, supply, and something labeled recon that I'd come to understand within the hour. Processing was exactly what the word implies: systematic, depersonalized, necessary. A clerk took my name, date of entry into the bunker, pre-outbreak occupation, and medical status. A medic checked my vitals, noted my weight loss. 14 pounds, which seemed abstract until I saw the number, and cleared me for non-clinical assignment. A logistics officer issued me a sleeping bag, a toiletry kit, and a colored armband. Yellow, unassigned specialist. I was separated from the group. This happened without announcement. The processing system was designed to sort incoming survivors by utility, and utility had no interest in the relationships that it had formed underground. Lewis and Constance were directed to the general population zone. Boyd was flagged for physical labor crews. Emmett, when he disclosed his correctional background, was pulled aside by a man in civilian clothes who spoke quietly and at length. Gerald was taken to the medical tent. Bev followed. Derek and Soo-Yoon were processed as a domestic unit and assigned adjacent berths. Aurelia and Thomas were directed to the family zone. And when the processing clerk asked for documentation of their relationship, Aurelia said, "I'm his." And the clerk looked at Thomas and typed something and didn't ask again. I watched my bunker family disassemble into bureaucratic categories and felt the specific grief of an engineer watching a structure she'd come to know be decommissioned. The relationships weren't gone. They were reclassified. And reclassification, I was learning, was how the surface managed the unbearable complexity of mass survival. Sykes found me in the engineering intake queue. She carried a tablet displaying satellite imagery overlaid with structural assessment grids, a system I recognized as a modified version of the ATC-20 Rapid Evaluation Protocol used after earthquakes. "How much do you know about post-event structural triage?" she said. "It was 30% of my graduate work." "Then you're ahead of most of what I've got. Come with me." She led me through the recon zone, which stood for reconnaissance and condition, I learned, into a room that had been, in its previous life, a coach's office. Now it contained folding tables covered in maps, a whiteboard with sector designations, and 4 people who looked like they hadn't slept in the same week. "This is the clearance team," Sykes said. "Their job is to assess which structures in the Beaumont metro area are safe for reoccupation. They're working sector by sector, building by building, and they're 2 months behind schedule because I've got 2 engineers for a city of 120,000 structures. How many of those structures are still standing? About 60%. Of those, maybe half are structurally sound. Of those, a quarter are in sectors we've cleared of biological threat. That gives us roughly 18,000 potential reoccupation sites. And we've assessed 400. The math was staggering, but I'd been doing staggering math for 5 weeks, and my capacity for it had been recalibrated downward. I looked at the maps. I looked at the protocols. I looked at the 2 engineers, both civil, both young, both wearing the compressed exhaustion of people who understand the gap between what's needed and what's possible. "I'll need site access, transportation, and a structural kit," I said. "Level, plumb bob, crack gauge, moisture meter at minimum." Sykes made a note on her tablet. "You'll have it by tomorrow. Today, rest, eat. Remember what sunlight feels like." I didn't rest. I found Lewis instead. He was in the general population zone, sitting on a stadium seat with Constance beside him. Their posture had changed from the truck. No longer leaning into each other, but sitting upright, spaced slightly apart. The way people sit when the emergency that fused them has passed and they're recalibrating into their individual shapes. Lewis was reading his Bible. Constance was watching the stadium floor with the analytical intensity I recognized from her inventory work. She was counting something. Beds, maybe. Or people. Or the distance between what she'd managed and what remained to be managed. "Wren," Lewis said, "you look like someone who's been given a job. They want me on structural assessment." He nodded. "Good. The Lord provides the tool and the task in the same hand. Lewis, I need to tell you something I should have told you in the bunker." I told him about the crack, about the settlement, the moisture, the structural compromise I'd monitored and patched and kept from him for weeks. I told him that Gerald and I had made the decision to manage it quietly, and that the decision had been mine. I told him his bunker, his hurricane shelter, his built-with-his-own-hands refuge, that had been slowly failing, and that I'd treated the information as engineering data rather than as something the people living inside it deserved to know. Lewis listened. He closed his Bible over one finger, marking his place. He looked at me with the same face he'd worn when he gave me the key. The face of a man who has chosen to trust a specific person for a specific reason, and is watching that reason confirm itself. "I know," he said. "You knew about the crack? I built those walls, Wren. I felt them shift before you ever touched them. I knew by day 20 that the southeast corner was taking water. Then why didn't you? Because you were handling it. And because telling 13 frightened people that the walls were weeping would have cost something I couldn't calculate and you couldn't engineer. Some information serves the people who hold it. Some serves the people who don't. Within 48 hours, I was in the field. Sykes paired me with a soldier named Corporal Ad Bancole, a Texan by way of Lagos, who drove our assessment vehicle with the relaxed competence of someone who had accepted that the world's new terms included daily encounters with the dead and had adjusted his commute accordingly. Aide carried a rifle, a first aid kit, and an encyclopedic knowledge of Beaumont's residential architecture that came from a pre-outbreak side business in property inspection. He was the most practically useful person I'd met since Emmett. Our sector was West Beaumont. Residential, mostly single-family homes built between 1960 and 2005. Wood frame and brick veneer, the kind of construction I could read from the street. We'd approach a block. Aide would scan for biological threat. His term. The military had abandoned the word zombie with a professional thoroughness that suggested official directive, and I'd assess structures for reoccupation suitability. The work was methodical, repetitive, and deeply strange. I'd walk up to a house, check the foundation for settlement or cracking, examine the roofline for sag, test exterior walls for plumb, and note any visible damage from fire, impact, or water intrusion. Then I'd mark the structure with a spray-painted code: green for sound, yellow for compromised but repairable, red for condemned. And we'd move to the next one. In a good hour, we'd assess 15 structures. In a bad hour, one involving biological contact or a building whose interior told a story I couldn't unread. We'd assess 2. The infected were still present, not in the dense, overwhelming swarms of the early outbreak, but in the specific, distributed way that a population becomes endemic rather than epidemic. They were inside buildings, mostly. Behind closed doors, in rooms they'd sealed themselves into during the initial chaos and never emerged from. They'd gone still, many of them. Not dead, but static, standing or sitting in postures of arrested motion, waiting for a stimulus to reactivate them. Aide called them sleepers. The first time I opened a front door for a structural assessment and found 3 of them standing in the living room like furniture left by previous owners, I didn't scream. I closed the door carefully, marked the house with a red X, and walked back to the truck with my hands shaking so badly I couldn't hold the spray can steady. "First time?" Aide asked. "In a room, yes." "You get functional with it. Not comfortable. Functional." He was right. By the 3rd day, I was functional. By the 5th, I was something worse. Efficient. I could read a house from the porch and know, before entering, whether the damage pattern suggested human occupation, infected presence, or vacancy. The tells were structural. Infected don't open windows. They don't use doors properly. They break them from inside in specific patterns, and they change the acoustic signature of a building. An empty house resonates. An occupied house absorbs. I learned to knock on exterior walls and listen for the difference, and the knowledge cost me something I couldn't name but could feel. A willingness, maybe, to see buildings as separate from the things inside them. On day 6 of fieldwork, day 41 since I'd entered Lewis's bunker, I assessed a house on Magnolia Street that stopped me. It was a single-story ranch, brick veneer, built in 1978 based on the foundation stamp. Structurally sound. Good roof, solid foundation, no visible settlement. Green tag, reoccupation suitable. But the front yard had a vegetable garden that someone had been tending recently, not pre-outbreak. The plantings were too young, the soil too freshly turned. Someone had been here, alive, gardening within the last week. Aide and I cleared the house. Empty. No infected, no bodies, no signs of distress. The kitchen had canned goods on the counter, organized by type, and a handwritten inventory list on the refrigerator that looked so much like Constance's notebook that I had to sit down. Someone had survived here. Not in a bunker, not in a stadium, not in a military processed extraction zone. In a house, with a garden, on a street where the neighbors were dead or worse. Someone had survived by staying, and tending and maintaining a version of normal that the rest of us had abandoned for the mathematics of sealed systems. I marked the house green and wrote, "Evidence of recent habitation," on the assessment form. Aide noted the GPS coordinates for follow-up. We moved on. But I carried that garden with me. Those small green shoots pushing through Beaumont clay. And I felt them take root in the part of my mind that still believed engineering was the answer. Day 44. I was eating dinner in the stadium cafeteria. Reconstituted soup, bread baked on site, water that tasted like civilization. When Emmett found me, He'd been absorbed into the security infrastructure within 72 hours of arrival, assigned to what the administration called population management, which meant exactly what it sounded like and required exactly the skills his career had developed. He wore a blue armband now. He looked rested, which on Emmett registered as slightly less compressed. "I need to show you something," he said. He took me to the communications zone, which I'd passed but never entered. Inside, a bank of radios and a satellite uplink operated around the clock, staffed by military and civilian technicians managing the information architecture of survival. Emmett led me past the main stations to a smaller setup in the corner, a short-wave receiver connected to a recording device, monitored by a civilian woman in her 20s, who wore headphones and the 1,000-yard stare of someone who spends her days listening to the end of the world in real time. "Play the recording from this morning," Emmett told her. "The one on 7.255. She queued it up. Through the speakers, static. Then a voice, male, accented in a way I couldn't place, speaking English with the deliberate cadence of someone choosing words for maximum clarity. "This is Beaumont Community Radio, broadcasting from the Magnolia Street station. We are a civilian network. We are alive. We are growing food. If you can hear this, come to Magnolia. We have room. We are not military. We are not processed. We are home. Magnolia Street, the house with the garden, the green shoots in Beaumont clay. It's been broadcasting for 3 weeks, the technician said. Low power, shortwave only. Hard to pick up unless you're scanning the civilian bands specifically. Does Sykes know?" I asked Emmett. "Sykes knows. Sykes's position is that unaffiliated civilian settlements are a security risk and a resource diversion. She's not hostile, but she's not extending support. They're outside the grid. How many people?" "The broadcast claims 40. No way to verify without a site visit. I assessed a house on Magnolia 3 days ago. Evidence of habitation. Garden, organized supplies, someone living there." Emmett nodded. "I know. I read your field report. That's why I'm showing you this." I understood. Emmett was doing what Emmett had always done. Constructing a parallel architecture, finding the structural opportunities that the primary system overlooked. Inside the bunker, that instinct had been adversarial, aimed at undermining Lewis's authority because Lewis's authority conflicted with survival. Here, it was different. Here, the primary system, Sykes, the military, the stadium, was functional but incomplete. It was processing survivors, assessing structures, managing populations. What it wasn't doing was recognizing that some survivors had already solved their own problem. The people on Magnolia Street hadn't waited for extraction. They'd extracted themselves. They'd planted gardens and turned on radios and said, "We are home in a frequency the official channels weren't monitoring." "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "Your next assessment sweep goes through that sector. Extend it. Walk the street. Count houses. Read the structures the way only you can read them. Tell me if what they've built is real. And then build the case." I looked at him. Same phrase he'd used in the bunker, when he'd asked me to undermine Lewis with structural data. But the vector was reversed. In the bunker, he'd wanted to use engineering to close a door. Here he wanted to use it to open one. "You've changed," I said. Emmett considered this with the same flat, evaluative patience he'd given every proposition I'd ever made to him. "I've been reassigned," he said. "Different box, different population, same physics. But the objective function is different. In the bunker, I was optimizing for survival. Here, I'm optimizing for something that comes after. What comes after survival? Address. A place you can name when someone asks where you live. Day 47. Aide drove us to Magnolia Street at dawn. The truck threading through cleared corridors that were becoming familiar enough to feel like commute rather than mission. The morning was warm, Beaumont warm. The kind of heat that has weight and texture and sticks to your skin like a second set of clothes. I'd been outside for 12 days now, and the sun still felt like a language I was relearning. Magnolia Street was 12 blocks long, running east-west through a neighborhood built in the 70s when Beaumont was expanding, and Optimism was a zoning designation. The houses were modest, well-spaced, with mature trees that had survived the outbreak the way trees survive everything, by being uninteresting to anything that craves warm blood. The street had not been cleared by the military. No barricades, no painted lane markers, no bio-positive stencils. It existed outside the grid, which was both its vulnerability and its authority. I saw the gardens first, not just the one I'd found before. Multiple gardens, front yards and side yards, and one ambitious plot that had consumed an entire driveway. Young vegetable plants in rows, supported by stakes improvised from fence slats and curtain rods. Compost bins made from trash cans with holes drilled in the sides. A rain collection system built from gutters and plastic barrels that showed a practical ingenuity I admired professionally. Someone here understood water management. Aide stopped the truck at the midpoint of the street. I got out. The silence was different here. Not the dead silence of cleared sectors or the loaded silence of infected zones, but the working silence of a place where people were busy. I could hear it in the background. A hammer somewhere, a voice calling a name, the rustle of someone moving through a garden, the sounds of occupation, of home. A man appeared on the porch of a house 2 doors down, mid-60s, dark skin, white hair, wearing coveralls and work gloves, and an expression that balanced welcome with assessment in exactly the proportions the situation demanded. He looked at the military truck, at Aide's rifle, at my yellow armband, and made calculations I could see moving across his face. "You the engineer that marked Carlos's house last week?" he said. I assessed a structure at 1847 Magnolia. "Yes. That's Carlos's house. He saw your green tag. It meant something to him. Meant the building was officially sound." He came down the steps. "I'm Vernon. Vernon Lyle. What passes for a coordinator around here. Which mostly means I'm the one who writes things down." Aide stayed with the truck, scanning the perimeter with professional calm. I walked with Vernon. He showed me what they'd built. Not in the bunker sense of sealed and hoarded, but in the open, accumulative sense of a neighborhood that had decided collectively to remain. 43 people, 18 houses in active occupation, a water system drawing from a functioning municipal line that someone, a plumber named Rowe, had traced back to a gravity-fed tower and manually reactivated. A food network built on gardens, scavenged goods, and a fishing operation running out of the drainage canal a quarter-mile south. A medical station in a converted garage, staffed by a veterinarian named Priya, who had adapted her skills with the pragmatic flexibility that catastrophe demands. A school, an actual school, running 3 hours a day in a living room, taught by a retired teacher named Hazel who refused to let the end of the world interrupt the 3rd grade curriculum. "We didn't plan this," Vernon said. "I was just the guy who didn't leave. Then Roe came, and she fixed the water. Then the Garcias came, and they knew about gardens. Then Priya and Hazel, and one by one, people showed up who knew something the rest of us didn't. Nobody's in charge. We just keep answering the next question." I assessed structures as we walked. 15 of the 18 occupied houses were structurally sound. Green tags, immediate reoccupation suitable. 2 needed foundation work. 1 had a compromised roof that would fail in the next hurricane season. I documented everything with the thoroughness my training demanded. And with each assessment, I felt the ground beneath my professional identity shift. I'd been evaluating buildings for reoccupation suitability. These buildings were already occupied. The assessment was retroactive. I was certifying what people had already decided with their bodies and their labor, and their refusal to wait for official permission to live somewhere. Vernon showed me the radio station last. A bedroom in his own house, converted with a shortwave transceiver, a car battery, and an antenna made from copper wire, and a telescoping mast that had probably started its life as a flagpole. This was where the broadcast originated. This was the voice on 7.255 that Emmett had made me listen to. I broadcast twice a day, Vernon said. Morning and evening. Same message. Come to Magnolia. We have room. We are home. 17 people have come in since I started. 17 people heard the signal and walked here. The military knows about you, I said. I know they know. Captain Sykes sent a patrol through here 2 weeks ago. They looked, they left, they didn't interfere. We're not a threat, and we're not a resource. So we exist in the space between attention and neglect. That's fine. That's where gardens grow. I stood in Vernon's radio room and looked at the equipment. Amateur, improvised, fragile. And I thought about Emmett's phrase, address. A place you can name when someone asks where you live. The stadium was processing. The military was infrastructure. But this room, signal. This street with its gardens and its school and its veterinarian learning to set human bones. This was address. Vernon, what do you need? He looked at me the way Lewis had looked at me when he handed me the key. The look of a man who has been carrying a specific question and has found the specific person shaped to receive it. An engineer, he said. We need someone who can tell us what these buildings can hold. How many more people this street can support. Where the water system is vulnerable. Which structures need reinforcement before storm season. We need someone who reads buildings. I wrote 2 reports. The first was official. A standard ATC 20-sector assessment for Sykes and the clearance team, documenting the structural status of every building on Magnolia Street in the professional language the Corps of Engineers required. Green tags, yellow tags, recommended interventions, timeline estimates. Clean, factual, and useful only to a system that processed buildings as real estate rather than as homes. The second report was Emmett's. I wrote it at 2 a.m. on my stadium cot by flashlight, in a notebook I'd taken from the supply zone. It was an infrastructure analysis of the Magnolia Street settlement. Water capacity, food production potential, structural carrying capacity for population growth, medical capabilities, communication range, defensive vulnerabilities, and the single metric that no official assessment protocol includes, social cohesion. I documented what Vernon had built not as a collection of structures, but as a system, and the system was sound. I brought both reports to Sykes the next morning. She read the official one first, nodded, filed it. Then she read the second one. This isn't a clearance assessment, she said. No, it's a viability assessment. That settlement is functional, self-sustaining, and structurally sound. It's also growing. 17 arrivals in 3 weeks from radio contact alone, if you extend logistical support. Medical supplies, structural materials, communication equipment. It becomes a model for decentralized reoccupation across the metro area. Sykes set the report down. At CD, I have 18,000 structures to assess, 400 survivors in the stadium alone to house, and a chain of command that measures success in sectors cleared per week. I don't have bandwidth for a neighborhood garden project. Then don't allocate bandwidth. Allocate me. She looked up. Reassign me to Magnolia Street as a permanent structural liaison. I assess their buildings, I reinforce their infrastructure, and I report back to you with data on decentralized settlement viability. If it works, you have a template. If it fails, you've lost one yellow armband. Sykes was quiet for a long time. She was calculating. Not the way Emmett calculated, with institutional maneuvering, but the way engineers calculate, with load and capacity and margin. You'd leave the stadium. I'd leave the stadium. For a street, for an address. She picked up the report again. Read a section, set it down. I'll give you 60 days. After that, I need a viability determination. If Magnolia can demonstrate sustainable population growth and structural integrity through one storm cycle, I'll recommend it to Regional Command as a pilot site. I took both reports back. I walked through the stadium one last time. Past the processing zone, past the medical tents, past the cafeteria where I'd eaten reconstituted soup and felt grateful for it. I found Louis in the general population area. He was reading. Constance was beside him, writing in a new notebook she'd acquired from supply. "I'm leaving the stadium," I said. "There's a neighborhood. They need an engineer." Louis closed his book. "The Lord provides the tool and the task." "You said that already." "It bears repeating." I found Emmett in the security office. I handed him the second report. He read the first page and looked at me. "You built the case," he said. "I built a different case. Same data, different architecture." He nodded. Slowly, with a particular quality of recognition that passes between people who have been in a box together and emerged with different understandings of why boxes exist. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Population management expertise. Vernon's group is 43 and growing. They've been self-organizing, but they'll hit complexity thresholds. Disputes, allocation questions, governance. They'll need someone who's seen what happens in confined populations. I'm not confined anymore." "No. But you know what confinement teaches, and you know what it costs. And that's what they'll need when the questions get hard." I found Aurelia last. She was in the family zone with Thomas, who was drawing. Houses with doors, always open doors. She looked at me, and her face did that thing again, the simultaneous flush and drain, the blood unable to decide. And she said, "You're going. There's a street with a garden and a school. Thomas could draw there." Her eyes filled. She didn't speak for a moment. Then, "Where?" "Magnolia Street. 12 blocks, 18 houses. A woman named Hazel who's teaching 3rd grade in a living room." Aurelia looked at Thomas. Thomas looked up from his drawing. He held it toward me. A house, green, with a door standing open and 2 figures in the yard, one tall and one small. "Can I bring this?" he asked, meaning the drawing. "You can bring everything," I said, meaning more. I walked out of the stadium at noon on day 49. The sun was high and the air was thick, and Beaumont lay around me in its wrecked, partial, stubborn persistence. I carried a structural kit, a sleeping bag, and 2 reports. One that described buildings, and one that described what buildings become when people decide to remain in them. Behind me, the stadium processed and organized and managed. Ahead of me, a street grew food and taught children and broadcast a signal into the frequencies that official channels don't monitor. I chose the signal. I'm recording this from Vernon's radio room on day 63. The antenna hums above the roof. The transceiver is warm under my hand. Outside, Magnolia Street is loud with the specific noise of people building. Hammers, voices, a child laughing in a yard where vegetables are growing through Beaumont clay. We're 57 now, 14 more since I arrived. Each one came because they heard the broadcast and walked toward it. Emmett is here. He arrived on day 55, carrying a clipboard and a look I'd never seen on him before, the look of a man who has chosen a box he wants to be inside. Aurelia and Thomas are here. Thomas goes to Hazel's school. He draws houses with open doors and has started adding gardens. Louis broadcasts the evening signal. His voice carries and the frequency holds, and somewhere in the dark, someone hears it and begins to walk. I assess structures. I read buildings. I certify what people have already decided with their hands and their presence and their insistence on remaining. Every green tag I paint is a small, technical act of faith. Not in God, not in systems, but in the specific molecular stubbornness of a wall that has been asked to hold and holds. My name is Ren Atsidi. I'm a structural engineer. I live on Magnolia Street. If you can hear this, we have room.